Hey folks, welcome back. We're on day 4 of basic design. So in day 4, it's largely a day of exercises, which is a fun day for me. But we go through a couple of exercises um, and an introduction to Illustrator, which I'm not going to cover too much the introduction to Illustrator, but maybe I'll talk about a little bit of the broad ethos. So the students have worked with their thumbnails. They've received their critique on the third day, and now we're already ramping up the complexity by talking about set making. And I like to give the students, they have to take 6 of their thumbnails from the variety of different categories that they're in, and they have to make a cohesive set. And I don't define set because I like to see the different strategies. And so we have, they received a bunch of votes, so to speak, from the critique the previous day. Some of them go and they select all of the thumbnails that got the most votes. Someone said they just picked their favorite. Another took a strategy of, I want to find all the simplest ones and put the simplest ones together. We had someone who said, I purposefully chose the ones that did not get any votes. And they try to coordinate these together. And I like to ask, what is a set? Which feels like a really basic question. First of all, this class is basic design. Second of all, we so often presume a common understanding of very simple terms, and we need to talk about it in order to realize, oh, I wasn't thinking of it that way. So a lot of the students in both classes, when you ask what is a set, they almost always tend towards something where they're talking about a unity, something coming together, unified through common characteristics, which is true. Most sets are that. But I had a really good student today mention, really, it's whatever you put together, because you can put together things that are very different and suddenly they're a set. So a set is whatever you call a set. And this was interesting because you could argue that you kind of have a modern perspective versus a postmodern perspective there. And I actually think something in the middle is more accurate. I think both modernism and postmodernism have their strengths and weaknesses. And so what I like to talk about is, yeah, but there's a way that if things are too varietous, if there's too much lack of common unity happening, then we don't actually see things as a set, and rather we have to be told that things are a set, which is the weakness of postmodernity, is not that things are working within innate understandings of how human beings interact in space, but rather they're trying to do top-down contextual control in order to force their message because they believe that there is no intrinsic commonality between anything. And that may or may not be true at a philosophical level, but when in design, we're making things for human beings, and human beings don't act that way naturally. We see things in a gestalt manner, and when you have properly coordinated a set, suddenly we don't see a thing made up of individual parts. Suddenly we see a cohesive whole. And we might even still understand that it's different. And I like to talk about one of the reasons why I'm not trying to explain set beforehand is I don't like them to overanalyze. I want them to tap into their intuition, their gut feeling. And so many of us do have a gut sensitivity towards unity and set making. So much of popular critique of things, like everyone's a critic. Everyone goes and watches the Barbie movie and is either they love it or they hate it. Almost all of the qualifying categories that a run-of-the-mill layperson is going to critique will have something to do with unity of form, as in they have a standard expectation as to what a movie should be about, and it either united to that thing and so they liked it, or it was varietous. It varied away from that thing and so they didn't like it. So we have these conversations in order to demonstrate that actually there are tons of ways in which common things bind things together, and then the variety thing actually helps a set distinguish itself from boring sets, because there are tons of things that are united and very closely united, and they end up being relatively ignored because of their full-on cohesion. And so as designers, we're trying to figure out, how do we unite things so that people see cohesive wholes, but how do we make them varietous enough that they're interesting and they draw people in and they surprise us, hopefully pleasurably, in a nice way. And so that's the point of this exercise. And so they make their first sets. We talk about why they did that, And then we start. I have a device, a little tool that I use where they can go through and they can assess someone else's set, and they can start tallying up different elements. How much white space is there? Was there a variety of scales of the squares themselves? Was there a variety of line weights? Is there symmetry or asymmetry? All of these different characteristics, and you go through each set, each thumbnail. So there's 6 thumbnails per set, and then you do this for each thumbnail, and you actually then get like a little data sheet that visually shows you how much unity was there. Were there a lot of places where you had 4 or 5 tally marks on the same characteristic? So something that might at first appear really, really unified, if there's a lot of white space being used, there might be a lot of unity there. But you also might find that, yeah, there's a lot of white space used, but there was a huge diversity of scale. There was a huge diversity of, rotation of the squares. Some of them were symmetrical, some were asymmetrical. You might have all of these different ways in which one really powerful unifying force brought the set together, but then the little sprinklings of variation amongst the other characteristics actually make this not quite a boring unified set. And so then we set up a scale, and again, this is like an oversimplification. This is not like the way to think about set making necessarily, but we put a scale diametrically of unity on one side, variety on the other, and then they look at their tally marks, and then we get a distribution. And it was interesting this year. This has been a trend. I don't know what to make of this. I would love to, if you're a weird psychologist out there interested in creativity and how this affects things, I would love to talk to you. But this year, as has been the last few years, both of my classes have trended towards being drawn towards making highly united sets. So there's been less variety happening. I don't know if that's just my location here and the kind of demographics that my college pulls, but that's what's been happening. So they had high unity. That's what they enjoyed. There were very few varietous sets. And then I talk about like the grading practices. And this is an important teaching moment, especially for folks who have not been in these sorts of design classes. If you're watching along and you're thinking, why can't I just learn the technical skills, or what's the value of an art school education? That's kind of the goal of these video series, is to communicate that. One of my grading rubrics is imagination, and I use that to try to help students understand that in creativity, in making things, we are trying to find interesting new ways of exploring and expressing these notions and ideas. People have been using black and white squares in their design classes for decades now, and it's surprising how frequently I see relatively new ideas and new ways of subtle twists on these different things. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that if I am grading them to my standard of my imagination, as in I'm telling these 18 through 22-year-olds that I'm going to grade them to my level of imagination, not their own, that is, it might be good for some students, but especially in a general education setting, that is going to be difficult at an undergraduate level. Rather, what I'm trying to grade is their growth of imagination. And so I need to assess early on in the class, where are they all at? And so me talking about the trend and the trends of my classes becoming more and more interested in organization and unity, and they're less interested in variety, diversity, and interesting new ideas. I've been seeing this a lot since COVID, by the way. It's been amplified. Usually in the past, I would actually get a two-peak distribution because my classes have art majors and non-art majors. You would find that the art majors were making really varietous sets and the other majors were making more unified sets, and that has been shifting. And so what has been happening is the unified sets have become more unified, and the varietous sets are like maybe in the middle somewhere. But yeah, I don't know. But again, this is part of me understanding where my students are at. If I've got students who are really, expressive artists who are just throwing paint around all the time, one of the ways I want to challenge their imagination is to be more organized, to think about how do you coordinate things with more intention? How do you not just be a whole mess? And there's a variety of reasons. If you're a professional artist, do you necessarily need to do that? Maybe not. I think it is extremely useful at multiple stages throughout someone's career. But these are students. They're beginning off. You need to be stretched to understand your horizon and your skills as much as possible in order to come back and understand where you are most productive and most successful in light of the fact that you've explored a large domain. Um, and so, what I'm doing here is assessing where is the class at as a whole and where are these individual students, because I'm watching the whole time, seeing what they're doing, and seeing, oh, this student is tending towards organization. I wonder how I can stretch them to be more exploratory, more imaginative. This one is extremely exploratory. How do I get them to be a better refiner, or to experience that rather than ignore these aspects of the creative process? All the while still telling them that just because I'm challenging you in this class doesn't mean that that's exactly the thing you need to do. Um, so that's the goal of this. This is wrapping up the end of week 2. I'm getting tired of squares, and we're going to work with them for one more day before we take a break from the squares. But it's good for them to see and to slowly walk through what is a creative practice. How is it both a balancing of intuition and rationality into what I would consider is a reasonableness, which I think is informed by imagination and intuition, um, in order to become successful creatives, in order to continually know how to create things over and over again, and not just run into that fallacy that I was mentioning with George Saunders's parable of Stan the other day. Um, that you have to have your intentions and you have to plan and plot beforehand and then execute. We need practice grounds where we explore different ideas, and we need to stretch ourselves in practice in order that when we find new problems that we haven't foreseen, we can become flexible and have a variety of responses at that point in time. So then I do an introduction to Illustrator. There's tons of videos about that, but really focusing for the students' sake, I like to explain these programs from a very nuts and bolts understanding of what they're doing. And so talking about Photoshop as a bitmap program or a raster program, um, and talking about Illustrator as a vector program and what are the differences there, and how does Illustrator handle things? How does it represent objects, and how does it think about, it doesn't actually think, but how should you think as you're interacting with that user interface versus a bitmap interface, and introduce them to that. Excellent. Have a good weekend.